Today in Muskogee, we are to interview Tams Bixby Jr., widely known and veteran newspaper publisher. The Bixby family history has been closely interwoven with that of the Indian Territory and the state of with Oklahoma Territory to the west. Mr. Bixby, would you, from your recollections and from your files, give us the background of the Dawes Commission and its accomplishments?
In the short time available, I shall be glad to do the best I can. And I should say that most of my comments will be based upon notes taken from a biography of my father's life, as I was a very young boy during the Dawes Commission's active days. Single statehood had long been talked of and was an issue in the Indian and Oklahoma territories. However, Indian leaders were opposed to single statehood and desired a state of their own. Congress regarded the Indian Territory as totally unprepared for statehood and started plans for many revisions which were not popular with the Indian leaders. There was no question about the power of Congress over the 5 civilized tribes since 1871, when legislation was enacted granting this power. The big problems were the liquidation of tribal governments and changes in the Indian land system from tribal ownership or communal ownership to individual title. Congress had been gradually reducing the powers of the tribal governments. Laws enacted in the 1880s and 1890s were primarily to protect rights of the ever-increasing number of whites in the Indian Territory. By 1906, the whites outnumbered the Indians several to one. Despite this, Indians retained all political authority and tribal governments owned all the land. Tribal schools were open only to Indian children. Even in towns, business and professional men could not own the land occupied by their stores, banks, and office buildings. Congress in 1889 authorized the establishment of a federal court in Muskogee. Its criminal jurisdiction was limited to non-Indian cases punishable by death or life imprisonment. The laws of Arkansas applied. From 1890 until 1905, Indian tribal courts and Indian laws suffered severe setbacks at the hands of the United States federal courts. More for the Chickasaws and Seminoles, and the Muskogee court retained jurisdiction over the Cherokees, Creeks, and Quapaws. Felony cases for non-whites were tried in Fort Smith, Arkansas, Paris, Texas, and Fort Scott, Kansas. Federal judges sat twice each year at South McAllister as a court of review and appeal. The Curtis Act of 1898 devastated further the Indian tribes' authority. Congressman Charles Curtis of Kansas, later U.S. Senator and Vice President, author of the act, was a part-blood Kaw Indian himself and had been reared much of his early life on a reservation. Communal land owning was stoutly defended by the 5 civilized tribes, but Congress established a commission to bring about the shift from tribal to individual ownership of the 19 million acres in the 5 tribal governments. This was called the Dawes Commission, and named for its senior member, Senator Henry L. Dawes of Massachusetts. Other members were Archibald McKinnon of Arkansas and Meredith H. Kidd of Indiana. Their task was prodigious. The first meeting of the commission was with the leaders of the 5 civilized tribes at Chakotah in February in 1894. The commission got a very cool reception. The Indians refused to talk the issue of Indian allotment of their lands. The commission then decided to visit each tribal capital for discussions with Cherokees at Tahlequah, Creeks at Okmulgee, Seminoles at Wewoka, Choctaws at Tuscaloma, and Chickasaws at Tishomingo. At all the places the commission got sharp rebuffs. All attempts at any agreements were utter failures. Irked by this situation, Congress in 1896 gave the Commission authority to survey the Indian lands without awaiting agreements. The Commission was raised to a membership of 5. Thomas B. Cabinez and Alexander Montgomery were added, while Frank C. Armstrong was replaced by Kidd. In May 1897, the Commission was again changed, and it was at that time that Tams Bixby of Minnesota, my father, and Thomas B. Needles of Illinois were appointed, and Major Breckinridge of Arkansas became a member of the Commission. The chairman of the Commission being of very advanced age, the active chairmanship was given to my father. Later on, the Commission was abolished, and Father was named as the sole commissioner. It was into an atmosphere of this bristling hostility that he came and took up his initial work. His first serious work was to revolutionize public sentiment and to get the Indians of the respective tribes in a frame of mind to meet the Commission and begin negotiations. His diplomacy and personality gradually broke down the barriers, with the net result that the Atoka Treaty was ratified with the Chickasaws and Choctaws June 28, 1898, pointing the way which later followed by treaties with the Cherokees, Creeks, and Seminoles. Following the negotiation of the treaties of the various tribes, the work of determining the value of these 5 estates and of determining the heirs thereto was the next move in the process of the evolution. The classification and subdivision of the 5 estates was carefully and scientifically gone into, with complete and exhaustive records compiled and permanently recorded, and these records show the acreage controlled by each of the nations to be as follows: Choctaw Nation, 6,900,000 acres. Chickasaw Nation, 4,700,000 acres. Cherokee Nation, 4,200,000 acres. Creek Nation, 3 million acres. And the Seminole Nation, 365,000 acres, making a total of 19,525,966 acres. A detail of the work of appraisement and classification was the personal examination of the character of the soil of each 40-acre tract, so that each certified heir would receive an allotment of equal value to that received by every other heir. One can hardly conceive of the enormity of this undertaking, and at its conclusion my father was regarded as the Indians' best and most influential counselor and friend. To take an area larger than 5 of the states of the Union, without an individual ownership of land in the entire area, subdivide it as to ownership among 5 nations of people, break up these 5 estates into 40-acre tracts, and after determining from more than 300,000 applicants for heirship that only 100,000 were legally entitled to be enrolled as heirs, and then to distribute this acreage equitably at to cash value among this 100,000 heirs, is a work without parallel in the history, according to the statement made before Congress by the Vice President of the United States at that time.
I should like to say to you, Mr. Bixby, that the records indicate that this work was accomplished by your father as chairman of the commission only after overcoming what appeared to be almost insurmountable difficulties and obstructions. Only a man of his superior mentality, with diplomacy of the highest degree of tact, energy, and strong personality, could possibly have succeeded in this undertaking, and it is because he possessed these talents to a most unusual degree that a splendid success crowned his effort in such a manner. At this time, I should like to quote from a few remarks by,
Okay.
Quote from a few remarks by James Sherman, for years chairman of the Committee on Indian Affairs, House of Representatives, later Vice President of the United States before the Congress. Quote, Tams Bixby's administration of the 5 civilized tribes was the largest trust ever administered in the history of the world, so far as there is any Commission, there did remain a volume of unfinished business and many problems, did there not?
Yes, the original members of the commission had been unable to get close to the tribal leaders, who had steadfastly refused to even consider the dissolution of their tribal governments. And I believe I explained in my earlier remarks that this was a most complicated undertaking.
From where did your father, Tams Sr., come to the Indian Territory?
He came to the Indian Territory from Minnesota, where he had long been prominent in politics, having been secretary to 3 governors of the state. It was during these years that he became the intimate friend and associate of President McKinley, Mark Hanna, Matt Quay, President Roosevelt, President Taft, Vice President Sherman, Secretary of the Interior Bonaparte, Hitchcock, and Garfield, Senator Beveridge, Senator Nelson, and other national leaders.
How long did your father remain with the Dawes Commission?
Father was appointed to the commission in 1897, and because of the advanced age of the chairman, he was made acting chairman and later served as sole commissioner until the work of the commission was virtually completed about 10 years later.
Had he been a newspaper man in his home state?
Yes, he began his career as a newspaper publisher at age 29 by establishing the Red Wing Sun, which was a weekly paper in Red Wing, Minnesota. He was also active in newspaper work in St. Paul, Minnesota, at one time being manager of the Pioneer Press.
About what date did he acquire newspaper interests in Muskogee? Civic affairs up until 1922, the time of his death, did he not?
Yes, he maintained an interest in the Phoenix and in civic affairs as long as he lived.
Then your father's newspaper and business activities were assumed by his 3 sons, yourself, Joel, and Edson. Is this correct?
After his death, my mother became president of the Phoenix, and my brother Edson became editor, and my brother Joel became general manager. At that time, I was very active in the commercial printing business, owning and operating the Oklahoma Printing Company. Upon the death of my brothers and my mother, all of which occurred during the year 1940, it became necessary for me to assume active management of the Phoenix, and I also became co-publisher of the Springfield, Missouri newspapers, in which my family still maintains a 1/2 interest.
And now a 3rd generation, in the person of Tams III, yourself being Tams Jr., is assuming some of the executive authority in the Muskogee, Phoenix, and Times Democrat, is he not?
Yes, at this time, Tams III is general manager, and my son-in-law, Walter W. Weber, is advertising director. Tams and I are also officers and directors of the Springfield, Missouri newspapers at this time.
Mr. Bixby, the Living Legend Library wants to thank you sincerely for this most interesting interview with the background of very important events within the 5 civilized tribes, culminating with these great people becoming an integral part of the state of Oklahoma. This interview will be in the library of the Oklahoma Christian College in Oklahoma City for all interested persons to hear, including the representatives of all communications media. A copy will be forwarded to you that yourself and family may have it in the files of posterity. Thank you.